It's pretty obvious weapons are a big hallmark when it comes to the fashionista and endgame of your characters in WoW. So much so that Blizzard will make wholly unique weapons that aren't something as simple as a stat stick item to give you a bit more flavor than usual. In this list, we're going to go over some of the weapons that have the most unique abilities tied to them, including but not limited to legendary items and more. To begin this list, we have Truthguard. During the Legion expansion, every specialization was given a very unique item pertaining to their spec, save for Evokers since they didn't exist at the time. For Protection Paladins, this would be Truthguard. It was created by Tyr and Arcades to defend themselves against their former ally Loken, who had since fallen into corruption. Equipping the shield will automatically place Oathseeker onto the main hand of your character, so no matter what, you're always going to be using the two in tandem. Now, if you played Legion, it's pretty obvious that every artifact was jam-packed with unique things. Sometimes you'd get brand new abilities and a ton of new passive effects from upgrading it with the artifact power. So that alone is grounds to let any of the 36 artifact weapons make this list. But honestly, that's a bit unfair to all the weapons in WoW. But the biggest reason Truthguard is here instead of another is its unique The Light Reveals passive it has. Occasionally, the player wielding the shield will approach an NPC that seems typically pretty normal, but then the shield begins to glow a brighter color, and an extra action button will appear on their screen. Pressing this button will reveal the deceptive NPC to be a demon, and allow the paladin to kill them in reward for some artifact power. This continues to work even if the shield is transmogged, and it's just a niche thing to allow paladin fans to experience dispensing justice for a bit, where class fantasy was at an all-time high in retail WoW. It worked generally for any demon NPC you would come across, but probably the most important use it had during Legion was during the Court of Stars dungeon. If your tank was a protection paladin, and you had just killed the second boss, normally you'd have to undergo the spy event and locate a hidden demon NPC amongst the Nightborn. With Truthguard in hand, you can just simply approach every Nightborn and look to spot its glow to locate the demon, rather than questioning every Nightborn you can for information. This made protection paladins slightly better than other tanks, but only in this singular event during Legion. It was just a very cool flavor for the protection paladin at the time and can still be recreated. It just has little to no use anymore, so it's only at number 10 nowadays.
Oh no, I seem to be lost in these woods. I hope no one tries to sell me product.
Hello there, are you interested in eating healthy but hate cooking?
Oh thank goodness. Can you tell me how to get back to the main road?
No can do, but I can tell you about how Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and more.
I just want to get home.
Factor now offers loads of snack options like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more to keep me going no matter what's on the schedule.
I was out here to bury a body.
Thanks to Factor75 for sponsoring today's video. Use my link to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. Every purchase helps me fund more content for you. And at number 9, we have a bunch of weapons lumped together. Aluneth, Xal'atath, and Thal'kiel. All three of these were also Legion artifacts like the previous entry. They all shared their uniqueness for reasons mentioned previously, but the more unique aspect they all had was that they would actually speak to you. At random times, either when equipped or transmogged, the weapons will say a voice line to you, usually pertaining to what you just did. An example of this is with Thal'kiel. When you attempt to cast a ritual summoning, will say,
"Seeking a creature from the twisting nether? Grabbing a beast of the void? Oh, you're just summoning a friend."
Aluneth may sometimes comment on the mage who's casting their Conjure Refreshment, saying,
"Your considerable talents are wasted on pudding."
But perhaps the more important portion of the voice lines, jokes aside, is they will sometimes monologue to you about lore in a certain area. For Xal'atath, she may whisper this to you while you find yourself flying around the broken shore someday.
It was here, in ages past, that the god of the deep lost a great battle to the god of seven heads. But as was so often the case, even defeat ultimately worked in N'Zoth's favor.
This is a pretty lore-heavy quote, as it implies a duel between the old gods N'Zoth and Y'Shaarj had for supremacy. This means that Xal'atath either witnessed or at least existed prior to the Titans discovering Azeroth. Mainly because before the arrival of the Titans, the old gods warred with one another for who could claim Azeroth fully. Ultimately, though, Xal'atath claims that despite N'Zoth losing the battle, it was still in his favor. Kind of ironic, because with Xal'atath being this super mysterious entity in the War Within, some of the answers may lie directly in the Whispers of our artifact version from Legion. Regardless, these are some of the only weapons in the game to ever actually speak to the player character directly in regards to their spells and actions, so it gives you a bit more class fantasy than others. But that's all there is to it. People already want certain artifact appearances for transmog anyway, but having a weapon with fully voice-acted quotes join in with you gives them a certain enjoyment that another may not deliver. And at number 8, we have Benediction / Anathema staff. Unfortunately, removed from the game now, this staff was part of a priest-only questline from Vanilla WoW to Wrath of the Lich King. To obtain it, you would need to defeat Major Domo Executus in the Molten Core raid. At around 50% chance, the loot contained would have an Eye of Divinity within. Either before or after acquiring the Eye, you would need to get the Eye of Shadow, which can be farmed off of high-level elite demons in Winterspring or the Blasted Lands. It's either that or killing the world boss Kazakh, which will guarantee the Eye of Shadow drop. Now that you have both the eyes, you will need to complete a quest that is only available while wearing the Eye of Divinity, since it's a trinket slot. Completing the Balance of Light and Shadow quest will then reward you with the Splinter of Nordersil. This quest is no small feat, however, and you will need to defend an NPC named Eris Havenfire from waves of hostile mobs. It also must be done entirely solo, as any outside help will spawn another mob called the Cleaner that will effectively kill you both and restart the quest. Once you've done all this, both eyes and Splinter in hand, you can right-click the Splinter, combine them, and form the famous Benediction staff for priests only. But this entry was about 2 staffs, you might be thinking. Well, from the tooltip shown, you can see that the on-use effect of the Benediction staff calls upon Anathema. This effectively replaces the original Benediction staff entirely and gives you a new one instead, although this time it's intended purely for Shadow Priests instead of Holier Discipline. You can repeat this step on Anathema to turn it back into Benediction as well, so swapping between the two as you see fit was in the priest's benefit. It had a 30-minute cooldown, so you did have to commit quite a bit of time to which version of the staff you wanted. But what other weapon can claim the capability of just replacing itself to either suit your healing or DPS needs? This staff was actually quite good too for the time, making it BIS for healing priests in phases 1 of 2 of Classic WoW, and a BIS for Shadow Priests in the same phases, if you were one of the very few playing Shadow Priests at least. There's really no weapon like it, but the biggest reason it's so high in this list is it's also no longer obtainable. You can get on a Classic WoW if you'd still like, sure, but it's no longer a BIS item for many priests with the raids like Naxxramas available anyways, so it's just number 8. And at number 7, we have the Corrupted Ashbringer. Probably single-handedly one of the most coveted weapons in all of WoW, Classic and Retail included. This weapon is the corrupted counterpart to the original Ashbringer weapon that Alexandros Morgraine used prior to his death at the hands of his son. This acted defiance and evil from his son, as he used the blade to kill his father, corrupted the blade, and entrapped the soul of Alexandros within it. Eventually, it ends up in the hands of Darren Morgraine, Alexandros' other son, and he wields it all the same as the Death Knight during the beginning event of the Wrath of the Lich King. However, before this, Alexandros was also brought back as a Death Knight, and Darien had killed him himself in an attempt to free his father's soul from the blade. Before that, Alexandros served as the leader of the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and you can only see this during the Naxxramas raid where he uses the Corrupted Ashbringer. His weapon, however, would only drop during the vanilla/classic era of WoW, and was removed permanently from the game upon the release of the revamped Naxxramas and Wrath. If you were one of the lucky few to ever loot this sword, you would notice a portion of the equip effect states, inflicts the Wheel of the Ashbringer upon the wielder. This effect will make your reputation stand with members of the Argent Dawn into hated, thus making them hostile towards you. However, at the same time, any NPC that is considered to be part of the Scarlet Crusade will now become friendly to you. This also leads to one of the more famous events in Classic WoW that almost no one really gets to see with their own eyes, as you need the sword in order to witness it. If you zone into the Scarlet Monastery dungeon, the NPCs will begin to kneel and praise you, for you are their new Ashbringer. They will claim a new dawn approaches, as you are the chosen one for the world. Even Ronald Morgraine, the son responsible for Alexandros' death, will yield to you and ask you to lead his people into a greater future. It is then the ghost of Alexandros returns and forces Ronald to beg for his life, only to be put down by his father for causing the damage he had in the past. You can then walk around the chapel area to the crypts behind Ronald and find High Inquisitor Fairbanks, who has since had his undead curse removed from him. Hereon, he infodumps a ton of lore regarding the Ashbringer and who it is, and even some stuff about the Lich King and Outland. This is one of the only moments in WoW's history where an event like this can occur by equipping a weapon, much less making every mob in a dungeon friendly to you. It's actually one of the most renowned events in WoW, despite the fact that no one really gets to experience it. But that's also kind of why it's only at number 7. No one can loot it anymore in retail ever, and in Classic WoW, it's still a pretty slim chance you can get the sword to begin with. Plus, if you are really interested in what the sword has to offer you, You can just look up a video online and find what you're looking for. Plus, it even whispers to you occasionally while you wield it, so that's extra points for its uniqueness as discussed in our 9th entry. But these whispers are definitely a lot creepier than just a joke about summoning a friend. And at number 6, we have Fandral's Flamescythe. As a random drop from Fandral Staghelm in the Firelands raid, you'd think nothing really of it at first when you loot it. However, if a druid happens to loot this staff and equips it, they will notice that their cat form is now a fire cat that Fandral himself uses for his encounter. This is the main drawing point to the staff for players, and since Shadowlands, it will now permanently unlock the cat form in the barbershop as a customization. You don't even really need to equip it actually, since learning the appearance at all will add the cat form into your assortment of feline friends. This staff can still be obtained and just needs you to go run Firelands raid on either normal or heroic. It doesn't matter which. No other weapon really works like this. And while its purpose in this entry is druid only, it lets one of the most popular classes in WoW to have probably one of their best forms to date. If you find yourself to be a Cataclysm Classic player, however, you just need to be wearing the staff instead to be able to use the form whenever you want. And if Blizzard intends on doing a Mist of Pandaria Classic, the alternative will be looting an item called Burning Seed. These spawn in the Firelands raid in a proximity to the boss that drops the staff, and using them will make your cat form a fire cat regardless if the staff is present or not. So for a pretty low effort farm, you can run around scratching, clawing, and burning your enemies. And at number 5, we have tier set weapons. As the name implies, these are weapons that have a bonus for combining them with an arrangement of other slots of equipments on your character. Typically, a tier set will require a player to wear up to 4 slots of a matching set to gain a benefit to their specialization. Although usually these are entirely reserved for armor slots, never something like a weapon, ring, or a trinket. At least, that's the case very often for gear in WoW. When it comes to the likes of the Twin Blades of Azeroth, if you're wearing both at the same time, your melee attacks will then have a chance to proc a haste buff on your character, while also giving you more damage against mobs that are considered demon. While not entirely BIS now, even for time walking gear standards, it was BIS for rogues and warriors back in TBC. Sure, it had the largest standard stats, but its tier set like bonus made it immediately one of the most sought after weapons at the time. There's also the Dalen Proudmoore Saber from Jaina Proudmoore in the Battle for Dazara lore. Combining it with Lord Admiral's Signet Ring will cause your auto attack to deal bonus frost damage while also slowing your targeted mob by 10%. It was an agility sword though, so the only people who could use it were demon hunters, monks, and outlaw rogues. So it wasn't actually used very often by players. The most recent introduction to this is the Void Reaper's Warblade from Nexus Princess Kaiveza in the Nurubar Palace. This is an agility fist weapon, so the amount of people who can use it is limited to outlaw rogue, enhancement shaman, monks, and demon hunters. Its bonus is combined with the Void Reaper's contract trinket obtained from the same boss. This trinket causes any ability you cast to have a chance to summon a phantom ethereal, dealing a bunch of damage to anything in its direct path. The fist weapon causes your attacks to sometimes apply a shadow dot to your target as well, called Queen's Bane. So now, anytime your trinket procs while the dot is applied, it will summon even more of these phantoms to assault your target. These kinds of weapons are far and few in number, so anytime they show up, they end up being the best weapons there is for players to use. They can even hold up pretty well for certain classes aiming to make a time walking set. So there's more reason to hold on to them when an expansion concludes or moves on to the next patch. They don't entirely change up how you play your class, but they do add a nice bonus that could be tracked to further enhance something like your burst windows or ramps when needed. So it's a good time to have it in the middle of our list for being generally fun to have, but not innately engaging usually. And at number 4, we have the Madness of Deathwing weapons. These weapons are pretty self-explanatory considering their name and are simply the items dropped from the encounter in question. The good news is that the boss drops only weapons, so there is no chance a piece of armor you don't really want appears and ruins the idea for your time walking or your BIS cataclassic item. As the final boss of the expansion, players were pretty let down by the encounter, and expected something a lot more grandiose to herald the name Deathwing. And while Blizzard may have hit this mark or not is something of a discussion for another time. The thing of note with these weapons is every single one of them had a unique equip effect upon wearing it. Sometimes it would proc haste for yourself and others and alternate between giving you agility or even increasing your character's size while the proc effect lasted, making you sometimes larger than the very boss you were fighting. Perhaps the most wanted and recognizable one from this era, however, was Gul'Thurek, Voice of the Deeps. Not only was it a very common transmog amongst players in the Cataclysm Mist of Pandaria era for its wicked look, but it had the chance to summon a Tentacle of the Old Ones to cast Mind Flayed your target for 12 seconds. The proc chance is around 2% per attack, but the crazy thing is that the proc had no internal cooldown, meaning that after you got a proc, you could immediately get another one or none at all. This grossly increased your DPS if you were a little lucky, and even had its usage in PvP due to the potential to proc the tentacles. The Mind Flay cast also dealt shadow damage, meaning Unholy DK's Mastery would actually increase the damage of the proc to deal even more damage, making them a terrifying DPS at the time. And to make matters worse, the Tentacles cast also slowed your target, making it even more useful for kiting situations or just general CC in PvP. It was probably one of the strongest two-handed strength weapons in the entire game, second only to actual legendary items that came before or after it. Although, speaking of legendaries, and at number 3, we have Shadowmourne. Suffice to say, it wouldn't be a weapons top 10 list without one of the most famous weapons to have been added into WoW. Created to become a counter to the Lich King's own famous Frostmourne, this axe is obtained through a few months long grind of repeated runs in Icecrown Citadel. Nowadays, it's very easy to obtain generally solo, and the only help you usually need is to kill Blood Queen Lanathel with a friend so that they can bite you, turn you into a vampire to complete that portion of the questline. As the quests do ask you to complete the fights with a bit more of a gimmick attached to them, but since everyone can crazily outscale the content, this isn't difficult anymore. The only challenge you may face is actually just outright killing the boss too fast instead. Obviously, BIS for all strength users during its time, Shadowmourne had the highest item level and stats one could want, along with an equip effect. This caused all your melee attacks to generate a soul fragment that would grant you strength. Once you collected 10 fragments, or have melee 10 times basically, you will let out a Chaos Bane on your enemies, dealing a chunk of AoE damage, and then granting an even larger sum of strength on top of this. This AoE effect of gathering the fragments on your target soul is probably one of the coolest way to demonstrate a weapon's power since it was introduced. With each gained fragment, more of the souls become visible and whisk around your character. Then to suddenly burst with energy at your target and cause high damage is very novel for just about anyone. Plus, if you look at the general design of the axe, it's just a Frostmourne as an axe instead of a sword. So it's the closest a player will get to the legendary Runeblade of Arthas himself. It'd be rude to not include it on this list, but because of similar reasons from before, you don't generally interact with the proc effect this weapon generates. Plus, it's pretty handy for speedrunning content and time walking for the strength benefits that it grants. It's just that it has a little bit of extra flair to make it a lot cooler, and is more well earned than something like Benediction. And for number 2, we have the Sylvanas Weapons. To kick this entry off, we're going to discuss the Edge of Night dagger first, and then the alternative. Basically, what this dagger did was cause all of your attacks to apply a debuff called Banshee's Blight. This debuff gives you a 3% chance per combo point spent to cause Banshee's Blight to deal a significant amount of shadow damage to your target. The debuff would progressively stack higher the more injured your target became to a maximum of 4. The dagger is specifically designed with only 2 classes in mind, the Rogue and Feral Druid. No other class actually uses combo points, so this is only for them and marks as one of the only combo point oriented weapons in the entire game. Basically, when they spent more combo points on something like Envenom or Ferocious Bite, this would trigger the Banshee's Blight and cause large amounts of single target damage. It was also not a unique equip item, meaning one could actually wield 2 of these daggers at the same time, effectively doubling their output. They were very, very BIS for Feral Druids and Rogues at the time, and it's one of the rare times Blizzard shows some attention to a lesser played specialization than something like a Retribution Paladin. However, Sylvanas' other weapon drop from her counter in the Sanctum Domination came in the form of Rashalar, Death's Whisper. This was a hunter-only bow item that marks it as the second hunter legendary ever added to the game. It was initially planned to just be an epic item by Blizzard, but they found its unique effect was quote-unquote too cool for just a regular epic, and thus made it a legendary. Upon equipping it, the hunter would gain access to a brand new ability called Wailing Arrow. It would cost 15 focus and fire an arrow that did a decent chunk of damage to your main target, and then exploded to hit all targets around it. Anything hit by this AoE would then be silenced for 5 seconds. This marks one of the rare opportunities where not only is a weapon the best for its stats, but also just gives you an entirely new button to press in your rotation. It's very rare Blizzard to do this, and it's funny to think one of the more fun items to use came from Shadowlands. Even now, hunters attempt to go after this weapon as often as they can, just for the looks alone. Topping us off at number 1, we have the Gavel of the First Arbiter. Ironically, another Shadowlands weapon. This two-handed mace drops from the Jailer in all difficulties from Sepulchre of the First One's raid. Upon view of this weapon, it had no secondary stats, just a typical strength and stamina stick. Although its on use would remove your target's soul. Pressing this would cause an additional mob to spew out from the target, which you can then also kill. It had a very low amount of HP and would almost always die in a single hit. When slain, you would gain one of 5 various buffs to your character. You would keep the buff for 60 seconds, and the mace would incur a 4-minute cooldown. To put it simply, these buffs were very powerful and made certain areas of the content trivial for the amount of damage it was causing. The buff you received was also totally random. It didn't matter the type of mob you were fighting or where you killed the soul. If you got the boon of assured victory, your attacks had a high chance to inflict a dot called Rotting Decay. This dot stacked up to 3 times and did massive amounts of single target damage. The boon of Divine Command makes your attacks sometimes deal arcane damage to all nearby enemies, while also increasing your armor. Boon of Harvested Hope causes your attacks to place a bleed dot on your target, healing you for the amount of damage it caused. Boon of Looming Winter made you proc frost damage on enemies and absorb a giant amount of damage dealt to you. And probably the most broken one, if you got lucky, was the Boon of the End. This caused your character to increase in size, gain a considerable amount of strength, and make all of your melee attacks have a high chance to proc a high shadow damage frontal to all enemies in front of you. This cleave, as its stats, were not target capped, so if you pulled around a dozen or so mobs and got this effect off, you were now passively cleaving them for so much damage they might be dead before the buff even ends. The Gavel was so powerful in fact, that at the start of the Dragonflight expansion, where you would imagine the Gavel would be retired, it continued to do the most amount of damage for strength users in their damage breakdowns. It was so bad that Blizzard themselves had to level lock the weapon to ensure that this fun aspect can continue to be created but unusable beyond level 60. And probably the funniest part was, despite it being a strength weapon, Blizzard had made a system that allows users to purchase any raid item of their choosing with a special token in Season 4 Shadowlands. This caused basically any DPS or tank class that could use a two-handed mace to instead drop their main stat and secondary stats from any other weapon in want of the Gavel's damage. It even made some tanks do more damage in DPS sometimes if they were lucky enough on a large pull. Basically, this thing was insane, and the little minigame attached to it was a very small price to pay for such a weapon, especially for it being only of an epic quality. Alright, and this completes the video. Are there any weapons you disagree with on this list, or ones you wish made the list in place of another? Be sure to let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to leave any ideas you may have for future videos just like this one.